Thank you, Amber. Can I firstly echo the acknowledgement of country and thank you for that generous welcome to country. And also, the Commissioner and I have talked often in the last few months about the critical role that Indigenous Australians play in keeping our borders safe and protecting our country. I was up in the Torres Strait just a couple of weeks ago, out on the islands, and literally we could not protect our borders and curb and stem this trade without the role of hundreds of Indigenous Australians, right from the Kimberley, the Northern Territory, the Torres Strait and beyond. Can I acknowledge Commissioner Shaita? Now, Amber is a commissioner by day, but is actually a choralist and a chorister by night, performing in Mozart's Requiem last week. And I think the creativity, last year, the creativity that you bring to the role is exactly what we need to tackle this problem, the interdisciplinary work. To the Border Force Commissioner, Gav Reynolds AO, you get an acknowledgement, and also the Deputy Commissioner from the AFP, because you're in uniform. But the room is replete with CEOs, Commissioners, Chairs, Chiefs, Captains, Commanders and colleagues from right across the Commonwealth, the States, Territories, our partners from New Zealand and the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, and many experts, including health researchers, professionals and community advocates. From the government's perspective, I'm not going to pull any punches in providing context for your critical work and deliberations today. You're not going to die wondering how we're viewing this problem. Anyone who tried to deny that Australia has a massive problem with illegal tobacco is either deluded or lying. Cheap smokes are everywhere, with a now ubiquitous, ridiculous retail distribution network. You would have to have your eyes glued shut in just about every suburb and town now not to see it. The latest official estimates in the Commissioner's 24-25 annual report are appalling. Between 50 to 60% of all tobacco products sold in Australia are now illicit, and this may get worse before it gets better. Organised crime groups are earning an estimated $4.1 to $6.9 billion profit from this trade, which can be reinvested into other nefarious businesses, including trafficking, scams and money laundering. And almost every vape purchased in Australia was illegal. About 96% of all e-cigarette products sold with a market value of around $1.6 billion. And what used to be seen as just a health and a revenue issue is now a serious organised crime issue and a crisis. These are not victimless crimes either. The explosion of this illegal trade has normalised law-breaking for a significant proportion of Australians, fuelling violence between crime cartels, hurting legitimate retailers and workers, and it risks unwinding the decades of success in tobacco control policy and our work over generations in lowering smoking rates in Australia. Illegal tobacco markets, of course, are not new. Every country has some level of illicit trade, and the ABF set up the Illegal Tobacco Strike Team in 2015. But a perfect storm of factors over the last decade has led to the situation which the country now faces. A massive surplus of cheap supply globally has been weaponised by transnational and serious and organised crime groups across the Middle East, Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Operating like multinational businesses, they're commodity agnostic. They're investing capital in what they perceive is a high-profit, low-risk enterprise. Now, you may notice that I left excise out of the problem set above, even though estimates of illicit tobacco excise evasion sit between $7.7 and $11.8 billion. That's not because excise avoidance is acceptable. Clearly it's not. But contrary to instinctive community suspicion, it's long been part of Australia's plan for tobacco excise collection to fall. But this was supposed to happen because smoking rates continued to fall, not through excise evasion and other crimes. So let me deal up front with the giant excise elephant in the room. Tobacco excise is a Pigovian tax, a tax levied on activities that generate negative externalities and costs borne by third parties. Primarily in this case, public healthcare costs through smoking-related deaths and disease. Now, a Pigovian tax forces producers to include the external cost in their marginal cost, making the price of the good reflect its true social cost, aiming to reduce consumption. The evidence is overwhelming that the single most effective lever to encourage people to quit or reduce the amount of tobacco they smoke and consume is price. Excise has been key to Australia's stunning success over decades in driving down adult smoking rates to amongst the lowest in the world, and that's a fact we can be proud of. This has saved and extended countless thousands of lives, as smoking kills 1 in every 2 users. 2 out of every 3 long-term smokers will die of a tobacco-related illness, and 20% of the cancer disease burden in Australia is due to smoking. Billions of dollars have been freed up to reinvest in other areas of the health system. But the conundrum, it's a paradox, as with all Pagovian taxes, is that high rates of excise over the last decade has contributed to the large price differential, one of the key drivers of the growth in the black market. Now, to deny this is nonsensical, but to acknowledge this does not mean cutting excise makes sense now either. This is the paradox, the conundrum. This is not a partisan issue. Our government inherited a rapidly growing mess, but successive governments had a bipartisan approach to tobacco control. And it's in the country's interests that this continue and that health policy not be surrendered to organised crime cartels. In any event, debating past policy choices doesn't help much now. The question our society confronts is what to do next. As of now, based on all of the information available and advice to government, there is no reasonable level of excise reduction that would make any material difference to the ubiquitous illicit supply chains and distribution networks now operated by serious and organised crime. So what to do then if we're not going to surrender? Now, the Commissioner's advice is clear, and it can be summarised in 3 ways. Firstly, the overriding goal of policy is to harden the environment and reverse the equation for organised crime at every step in every way, to make the illicit tobacco trade more risky and less profitable. Secondly, this will take time, and to disrupt trade we have to think about things at each stage: pre-border, at border and post-border. Pressure across the whole chain: production, air and maritime routes, freight forwarders, import channels, warehousing, distribution and retail fronts. Shutting down financial channels, the cash flow that fuels the cycle. I looked at the CEO of Austrac there. While the Australian Border Force is working in overdrive at the border, no country can win this fight at the border alone, as organised crime floods nations with cheap and plentiful product. I was in Singapore last year, and with their firm stance on law and order and tough border policies, they have an illicit tobacco problem. It's not shop fronts there, it's motorcycle couriers and sales online and via phones and messaging apps. But thirdly, to hammer down illicit tobacco's market share, agencies, people in this room, must collaborate and work as one system: shared intelligence, consistent priorities and coordinated action. That's what today is about: taking stock, challenging each other, being honest about what's working and what's not, and pushing forward together. Now, pre-border, we are doing more and doing well. Intelligence sharing with foreign governments and partners is rapidly improving, enabling disruption of more product before it even reaches Australia. Partners in the UAE, China, Singapore, Sri Lanka and elsewhere are collaborating. Now, the best container of illegal tobacco is one that never reaches our shores, that stays offshore because we've disrupted it offshore. At and post-border, in 24-25, the Australian Border Force achieved record levels of seizures, supported by $188 million of extra funding, seizing 2.66 billion cigarettes, up more than 320% from 4 years ago. Over 2 years, from the 1st of January 24, the ABF seized more than 14 million vapes and vaping products at the border with a street value of over $700 million. And the tempo matters to keep pressure on. Over 72 hours this year, between the 24th and the 26th of January, the ABF recorded 209 detections nationwide, seized 22 million cigarettes, 16,350 kilos of loose leaf tobacco, and over 20,000 vapes. A strong result. And I've seen firsthand also the risks that your officers take, because this stuff can be bundled with really toxic products, and there's serious risk to officer safety, and we do our best to support and protect them in their work. Other Commonwealth agencies are playing their part. The AFP's Criminal Assets Confiscation Task Force has seized more than $38 million of assets linked to illicit tobacco investigations up to the 1st of January, with further matters now under active investigation under the Proceeds of Crime Act. Stripping profits is essential. If crime doesn't pay, then the incentives shift. The TGA has taken part in more than 50 multi-agency enforcement activities to deter and disrupt the supply of unlawful vaping goods and is progressing now several investigations with the Director of Public Prosecutions. The ATO in 24-25 seized or destroyed 23 tonnes of illicit tobacco and over 6 million cigarettes. Nearly $60 million in excise equivalent duty, 28% higher than the previous year. So the point is, I'll stop the laundry list, but the point is that all of these things raise the cost of doing business for criminals. They interrupt the cash flow and the money laundering, which is what this is ultimately about. They disrupt the supply chains and distribution network. They make recruitment harder because people are deterred. And they send a simple message that the market is getting tougher, turning the ship around, as Amber put it at the start. But to be clear, in the government's view, it is post-border that we can now make the biggest gains at the lowest cost to disrupt this trade. Now, Australians will rightly think that any public official who stands up, whether a politician or a commissioner or a CEO or anyone in this room who stands up and talks tough about seizures, is not living in the real world unless and until the illegal retail shop fronts are shut down. And the only way this will happen is if the Commonwealth, the states and the territories work seamlessly together. Simply put, we need each other. Now, the good news is over the last 6 months, interjurisdictional relationships have rapidly improved. Truth be told, a year or so ago, I think most jurisdictions saw this as a Commonwealth problem. You collect the excise, it's your problem. Yet there's now a deep determination which has grown to work together. The buy-in of state and territory police ministers and commissioners has been especially critical given the urgent need to tackle serious and organised crime cartels. And following the work from the National Illicit Tobacco and E-Cigarette Coordination Forum, which identified 50 elements of legislative reform, the Police Ministers' Council received the distilled analysis of that in December, and work is continuing. But not everything can be done at once. So in early January this year, I asked the Commissioner to provide us with advice on what are the most urgent actions out of that list of 50? What do we absolutely critically have to focus on together to prioritise for the states and territories? And the Commissioner identified 8 critical activities relating mainly to licensing regimes, closure orders, landlord penalties and resourcing for the street level enforcement. Now, each jurisdiction has started in a very different place, but all of them are now acting. Leading the way, a bit of competitive federalism, but evidence-based, leading the way are South Australia and Queensland, who've toughened their laws and invested in enforcement with encouraging results. Now, in particular, they're demonstrating that when enforcement occurs in 100% of an area, of a geographic area, then retailers immediately see legal trade returning to expected levels. And the latest critical step was Victoria's announcement last Sunday that they'll shortly introduce laws to provide for long-term closure orders and raise the stakes for landlords, which has been warmly welcomed. The results of recent joint operations in WA and New South Wales have been publicised, and more national weeks of action, agencies working together with states and territories in each jurisdiction are scheduled. We're not going to tell the Crims which weeks they're scheduled, but they're scheduled. Commonwealth funding to states and territories is now flowing through the ABF, AFP and Health. There's $84 million over 2 years, which is helping to put trained people on the ground, improve licensing and compliance systems, and enable tactical partnerships and joint operations. Of course, though, when you tighten one part of the system, as we turn the screws on the retail network, the criminals will test another. As the crackdown accelerates on shop fronts, we're working to scale up resources to combat online sales, which is where the market will try and move as retail activity gets tougher. And health advocates are also doing interesting work, reflecting on the ideal future licensing and retail model, asking why our society continues to permit standalone tobacconists. Australia now has around 40,000 retailers serving about 8% of the population who smoke, compared with 7,000 petrol stations serving around 70% of Australians who drive. Now, that imbalance raises questions whether tobacco products, are your questions, I know you're working through, whether tobacco products instead should be sold only through mixed-use retail settings, subject to stricter licensing oversight and compliance. To be clear, they're interesting questions for the future, but it's not government policy, and in any event, the states and territories handle the licensing frameworks. But I appreciate there'll be very different views on these things to input into future discussions. Now, resources, of course, matter. And since January 2024, the Australian government's invested more than $345 million to strengthen the national response. But this is as much a governance challenge as it is a technical or an operational one. And so the ITEC Commissioner's work, as well as the ABF-led Illicit Tobacco National Disruption Group, give us a stronger national backbone to connect all parts of the system into a coherent system for faster disruption. This supports aligned legal settings, privacy safeguards and joint operational protocols that can pool and share powers and information. Better tasking and deconfliction and common targeting priorities, and intelligence cycles that move from detection to disruption, not just description. The ABF Commissioner will update you in a little while on the National Disruption Group, which is now kicking goals. Some things we can say in public forums, though of course much remains under wraps so that the criminals only find out about them when it hurts them. Al Capone got jailed for tax evasion, not for his violent crimes. And last year, Minister Burke announced a crackdown on high-risk financial services, including crypto ATMs. They're being used to launder profits and to conceal transactions. And last week, new laws were introduced into the Commonwealth Parliament to give AUSTRAC more powers to act. At the same time, the AUSTRAC CEO and the ITEC Commissioner warned banks to better scrutinise retailers linked to illicit tobacco to tighten the financial net around criminal supply chains. And we're seeing immediate results. There have been hundreds of high-risk accounts closed, reviewed and exited. Merchant services and private ATMs withdrawn, and suspicious transaction reporting has increased sharply as the banks are now focused on this and strengthening controls to shut down those money flows that keep illicit tobacco profitable. Cutting off the money flows is key. It starves the market and reduces its ability to regenerate after seizures. Following the money is not optional. It's central to durable disruption. And tougher penalties in all jurisdictions are part of the answer to give prosecutors and courts stronger signals. This is not just tobacco. They need stronger signals about the harm involved and to deter people from entering and staying in the market. And so I can announce today that the government will strengthen Commonwealth laws and increase penalties. Firstly, to make the consequences much greater for criminals, with new offences and increased penalties in multiple acts for importing, manufacturing, moving or supplying illicit tobacco, and creating new offences for dealing with the kinds of volumes that can only signal organised crime involvement. Secondly, to target unexplained wealth. Now, the AFP explained this to me and a number of the state police commissioners in recent months. While prosecutions are important, they can be very slow and very expensive. Not only, but in part because criminal syndicates throw KCs and senior barristers at every point in the courts and frustrate things for years. So hitting criminals where it hurts means using every tool, more rapidly taking their profits, their cars, their cash, their boats, their toys. Take them away. And this will mean closely aligning Commonwealth frameworks and the Proceeds of Crime Act with other jurisdictions. And thirdly, the raising of the penalties and some other legislative actions that we'll soon take means that we can activate enhanced law enforcement techniques like wiretaps and other tools to track and disrupt criminal networks by listing illicit tobacco as serious offences under the relevant laws. The government's also concerned about the rapid growth in the unlawful importation, advertising and supply of nicotine pouches in Australia, which you are seeing more often in your enforcement work. Quite simply, pouches are disgusting. Massive, unregulated, addictive doses of nicotine with substances that irritate the gum so the drug absorbs. There's no safety standard. They're replete with dangerous chemicals. They're linked to mouth cancer and holes in the gums. The government is actively pursuing options to respond to this growing threat, including reform of product regulation. Now, alongside disruption and enforcement, Supporting people to quit and avoid nicotine, as Amber said, remains important. The Cancer Council's Generation Vape study is encouraging. The rate of vaping amongst 14 to 17-year-olds started to drop late last year, falling from 18% in 2023 to 15% in 2025. The number of young people who have never vaped increased to 85% compared to 82% in early 2023. And the number of young people who have never smoked is at its highest ever level at 94%. Now, these are good reasons to remain hopeful that a new generation will not become addicted to nicotine, but hope is not a strategy. And public health experts are diligently monitoring the poly-use of cigs, vapes and pouches in the next generation. While the Australian government's Give Up for Good campaign is seeing promising results, the immediate priority now is and must be our focus on serious and organised crime. So in closing, I acknowledge this is hard. Progress will not be smooth or linear. In some places, things may get worse before they get better. But giving up is not an option, nor is being distracted or seduced by misplaced hopes and false claims about excise reductions. So what does success look like? Fewer shop fronts linked to illicit networks, an end to fire bombings, fewer violent incidents, a lower illicit share of the tobacco and vape market, rising prices for illegal products, stronger excise compliance, more proceeds of crime recoveries, and most importantly, safer communities and a fairer operating environment for honest retailers and workers. Criminal networks adapt quickly. They experiment. They look for weak points, so our response must remain unified and adaptive as we act with focus. Every seizure, every prosecution, every licence suspension and every dollar stripped under the proceeds of crime powers adds friction and puts the illicit market under further pressure. The discussions that you will have today really matter for Australia and Australians, given the scale of the problem that our society confronts. And so I do encourage you to challenge each other respectfully, to contribute, and I wish you well. Organised crime doesn't get to win. Thank you very much.